Now that you have some introduction to apocalyptic literature, I want to introduce you to the two oldest apocalypses that we have, and they're both found in the book of Enoch, or First Enoch. This is an extremely important book for the history of Judaism and Christianity that never made it into the Bible. It is extremely important for Christianity. It's actually quoted in the book of Jude. So at some point, some writers of the early church saw this as an authoritative book, but also it is so important to us because it actually is the first book to talk about the fall of the angels, and a lot of our understanding of various the heavens and everything actually come from Enoch rather than the Bible itself. So the book of First Enoch is very, very important. It is, of course, attributed to Enoch, who says in it's Genesis 5, and it says, when Enoch had lived for 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after the birth of Methuselah for 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, then he was no more because God took him. So depending on how you read those verses, Enoch was taken up into a very, very little reading would indicate that Enoch was taken up into heaven 2 times. Once during his life, and then he came back down, and then at death. So he is, along with Elijah, the only other figure of the Bible who is said not to have died a regular death, but was, or should I say, instead of death, was taken up into heaven. So let me clarify that. He did not die, but rather was taken up into heaven, and so went straight to heaven without having passed through death. But it's this idea, or reading of it, that says 2 periods, because you've got then Enoch understood as this, particularly in the Second Temple period, he becomes a figure of great speculation because of this belief that he had resided in the heavens with God, and then had been able to come back down and talk about it. So that there are, First Enoch is just one of many writings attributed to Enoch based on the speculation. Of course, Elijah is the other figure. There's a lot of speculation about Elijah during this period as well. We see speculation about Elijah even in the gospel narratives, and again, because he was taken up into heaven and did not die. So you get this, parallel figures in some ways. In even though it's very important for the early church, it really wasn't. It disappeared to the West, in essence, for many, many, many centuries. And the only copies we have of it really worth anything are in Ethiopic. They were preserved. Enoch was preserved by the church in Ethiopia. A lot of stuff we find there that we can't find anywhere else. So as in the 18th, 19th centuries, as Europe began to explore the monasteries and ancient spaces of Ethiopia, we found all these documents that our ancestors knew of, but we did not have copies available to us. So, and it's very interesting that it is particularly the Ethiopian church, because they have of all branches of Christianity, they have a looser sense of canon than other forms of Christianity. So they actively preserved more books than just the biblical books. So the book of Enoch is divided into 5 parts. This corresponds to the 5-part division of the Torah. Now, there is no one-to-one equivalency that the book of Genesis corresponds to book 1, Exodus book 2, etc. But there does seem to be a tendency to divide books into 5 parts, like as in some ways that sacred scripture comes that way, because that's how the Torah came. They were just all speculation, but it seems to be the case. Now, within the 5 parts, there are multiple documents contained within the different parts. So there's a lot of editing, a lot of ancient scripture, not ancient scriptures, but ancient writings that found their way in whole or in part into this composite book of First Enoch. Of the 5 books, we're going to look at certain ones of them, but just as a highlight, today we're going to talk about 1 through 36, which is the Book of the Watchers. And this, as I said at the end of earlier, it is the first elaboration of the fall of the angels, which has become so much a part of Christian understanding of evil. So that's what we're going to talk about that today. The animal apocalypse we're going to talk about later on is another one of the part of the Book of Dreams. It is really fascinating. It's an entire apocalypse, historical resume told where where people are animals. So, you've got the lambs and of God's people, and the ravens and the wolves, they're enemies. And then whenever a human appears in the animal apocalypse, it's an angel. But there are very, very strong parallels between the animal apocalypse and Daniel 7. So it gives us a really great insight into one of the few biblical apocalypses that we have. The so of the 5 parts, I'm just, as these are sort of highlights, highlights of it. Like I said, the fall of the angels, the animal apocalypse, and again, because of its relationship to Daniel. And then there's the Book of Parables. And the Book of Parables is probably the last. It's later than these other 2 parts, but it is really extremely important for tracing the history of the New Testament from an academic standpoint, because it is the only time the phrase Son of Man, or is one of the places where the phrase Son of Man, which becomes so important, of course, in the New Testament, because it is the term that Jesus adopts, calls himself the Son of Man, is a divine figure. The problem with, and we'll talk about this when we get there, the problem with the Book of Parables is that it's very difficult to date. So does it actually date from before the time of Jesus or after? Because it's probably 1st century. So to say that again, of the 5 books, we're going to look at, different parts of it. But the Book of Enoch overall, story of the fall of the angels, some really interesting understanding. It helps us to understand the biblical apocalypses much, much better, because it's particularly this section. And then this Book of Parables, where they talk about the Son of Man, which then takes us directly to the term that Jesus used for himself. So, today, we're going to talk about the oldest, the Book of Watchers, and the Book of Luminaries. So I want to start with the Book of Luminaries, or the astronomical book, but basically 72 to 82. As you read Enoch, you'll find that a lot of these chapters are so short that it's not nearly as long as it looks. The Book of Luminaries is an otherworldly journey. It doesn't speak a lot to us because, like I said, I think earlier, the concerns of the other world, of the apocalypses that take this form, are very, very Jewish, and they don't apply to Christianity as much. So the concerns of them. So again, it's an otherworldly journey or a tour of the heavens. Enoch then is taken up into the heaven by an angelic figure who tours Ezekiel through all the edges of the universe. So, and it can be a bit tedious. I don't know how you felt when you read it, but it's not a story, so it doesn't read that way. But again, it's very important for Judaism because it has to do with calendars, and we don't think of calendars as that important in a ritual sense, but it is fundamental to the biblical Hebrew Bible, Jewish Bible, Old Testament understanding of creation. So in creation, the idea is that, again, orderly creation. And that partly it has to do with the fact that every other part of creation gets it right, except for humans. So it's sort of a level of admonishment in it. But in terms of calendars, what is the big deal of the stars and the heavens and the earth and dates? And it really, if you go back to Genesis, the creation story in Genesis 1, particularly in 14 and 15, where it talks about the creation of light. And it says, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons." Okay, so a cursory reading from the modern perspective, well, yes, the signs and seasons, we are regulated by the sun and the moon and the movement of the earth around the sun and all that. But for the ancient Jew, signs and seasons were more than just what time the sun was going to set in a different part of the season. It had to do with, it goes back to the understanding of the spatial we're talking about an apocalyptic of a spatial transcendence. So you have the heaven, and in heaven we have God on the throne, and the angelic beings who surround the throne, worshiping in continuous worship of God. And then on earth, you have the temple. And the priests, who maintain continuous worship of God, in a different sense, but continuous worship and sacrifice at the altar to God. Here's where calendars are important. You want for your sacrifices and for your rituals to be performed at the same time that they're being performed in front of the throne of God. And this is really, this is the point. If there's parallel worship going on, then of course what's going on in heaven is the standard. So that the idea of signs and seasons is, at least in part, it's not just a way of regulating our world as a calendar, but it is a way of pinning our reality, our worship to the heavenly worship. Okay? So that's really why calendars are so important. So the calendar is to guarantee the efficacy of ritual. So if it was going on at the same time, it had to be going on at the same time. So particular rituals had to be done on particular days and at particular times. Now that would have been fine if everybody agreed on a calendar. But in the history of ancient Judaism, we know of, multiple calendars that they probably used over the 1,000+ history of the biblical material spans. And if you go back to pre-exilic material, did the new year begin in the summer? Excuse me, not in the summer, in the spring? Did it begin in the fall? Never began in January. And we believe that for some reigns during the monarchical period, yes, it began in the fall, and other times it began in the spring. And so you get those kinds of issues. But it's also, if you probably figured out that a lot of the biblical material is based more on a lunar cycle or a lunar calendar. There is one other Ramadan, by the way, in the Islamic faith, is the month of fasting. It is a lunar calendar that determines when the month of Ramadan occurs. So you probably, if you pay attention to this, and before I knew what was going on, it felt like every time I turned around it was Ramadan again, because if you take a lunar calendar and impose it upon a solar calendar, the months move around. So Ramadan moves around because we're trying to pin a ritual that's based on a lunar calendar to a solar calendar. Now, Judaism is a modified lunar calendar. So, for example, Easter, which is based on Passover, is, a movable feast, as they say, is not a fixed date feast because it's related to Passover, and Passover again moves around, but the Jewish calendar is modified so that even though the date of a ritual will move around, it'll stay in the same season. So that's the difference between why Passover moves around but stays in the same season, and Ramadan just moves around. So lunar calendar, a modified lunar calendar that at least pins the date to the same season. So, but we get even more, there's even more controversy when we get to books like Enoch and also Jubilees, which we're going to read later. But Jubilees has, and other literature that all seems to be connected, advocate for a solar calendar. And so you'll notice the very name Jubilees, which is an issue of dates, every 49 years, the periods of time. So these books advocate for a calendar that is not necessarily the prevalent or prevailing calendar of the temple. Just to give you an example of how important this is, when we talk about Qumran, the part of the major part of the reason why the community, and you probably know a little bit about Qumran, so these are Jewish priests who retreated into the desert around the Dead Sea, and they left because of a conflict over a calendar. And again, it was life or death in terms of one's spiritual relationship, when being right with God. The Qumran community were made up of individuals who left the temple because they believed that the temple in Jerusalem was following the wrong calendar. So it was not performing the rituals correctly because they were on the wrong day. So the Qumran community saw itself as the temple in exile, where it maintained what it thought was the correct calendar, so that proper worship on earth would continue, until those, priests, the stubborn priests in the temple in Jerusalem would realize that they're wrong, basically. That's what the Qumran community was waiting for. One of the events that occurred during this period is because of the difference. So for example, you couldn't, you had to abstain from warfare on a Sabbath or certain ritual days. So one of the sneaky things that the Jerusalem priesthood did was on a day where their calendar differed from the Qumran calendar, they waited until it was the holy day for Qumran and not for them, and then they attacked the community. So, and it was also another big deal among the ancient Jewish groups whether you could fight on the Sabbath, because the Romans just took advantage of that in general. If it was a day when the Jews refused to fight, so there were real consequences to this. There were both what they considered, real but spiritual, but also real events that are to occur because of these calendar distinctions. So that's really so you have an example of an otherworldly journey, introduced to the idea of calendars and the importance of calendars, and then we'll start to put together a body of writing like Enoch and Jubilees, which they didn't make it into the Bible, but they sort of grouped together as books that were resistant to the dominant narrative. So if you have any questions, but again, we'll come back to the idea of calendars when we get to Qumran in particular. So I wanted to talk about the Book of the Watchers, because if there's any part of Enoch, and if there's any book of the pseudepigrapha that was it's arguably the most influential on the way Christians think about heaven and hell, the good and bad, the fight between good and evil, and this idea of the fall of the angels. And again, this is not found in the Old Testament, but rather here. So, and as many say, we probably, as modern Christians, owe more of our understanding of heaven and hell to Milton's Paradise Lost than we do to the Bible itself. But one thing we can say is that Milton and others like him were very influenced by the legends as they come to us through the Book of Enoch. So, Watchers. Watchers is the name for the angelic guardians of the earth. So they are set to watch over human beings and watch over God's creation, because remember, God is transcendent. Even in again, go back to perhaps Zechariah, where you have the angelic beings who are chariots that are roaming around the earth. This comes from that idea. So it is, however, and you may be puzzled, you might be thinking about Genesis 6, where it talks about how the sons of God married the daughters of Adam, and you get this group of the Nephilim, which is a really difficult word. And so, yes, the Book of the Watchers is somehow connected, or the legends that stand behind, let me put it this way, whatever this reference in Genesis 6, what stands behind it is probably some form of this larger legend that we don't see until the Book of Enoch. Okay, so I wanted to, couple more things. Basically, in the body of the Book of Watchers, and it is, by the way, 1 Enoch 1 that is quoted in the book of Jude. So it is the Book of the Watchers specifically that is quoted in the New Testament. But within the Book of the Watchers, there are actually two stories that are intertwined about the fall, two different versions of the fall of the angels. There is one with the figure Asael and one with Semihaza. But before we look at them, I wanted to say specifically that they are both theodicies. The fall of the angels is at heart, or the legend of the fall of the angels is at heart a theodicy. It explains evil. How? Again, we go back to God's good creation, Genesis 1. But creation is not good anymore. And so how did evil enter the world? Oh, sorry, I hit the wrong button again. How did evil enter the world? And the fall of the angels is an explanation of that, of evil. And it's a problematic one because it, to greater or lesser degree, lays the blame, blames the divine world for human sin. It is, as I like to say, the original, the devil made me do it. So the devil, whether we call him Lucifer or Azael or Azazel or Semihaza or whatever name we give to it, that's what I mean when I say that these are explanations of evil or theodicies. So if you're ready, I guess I will move on, and I've put together, and just for clarification, so you can go back and we can really see it's really difficult as you're reading through the two passages, or the one passage, to see the two different stories. And they're spelled differently, but Semihaza and Asael. And so these are the two versions, this one based on Genesis 6, and this one based more on Genesis 3. So we'll start with this one. Basically, Genesis 3 is the idea of the angelic figures as teachers. So the idea that evil comes into the world because we have knowledge that we should not have had. So when the Satan figure, that was so wrong of me. There is no Satan in Genesis 1 or 2 or 3. There is a serpent who, in the original version, the serpent is just another member of God's creation. So the serpent is just as more crafty than any other of God's creation. So in the original, most basic understanding of Genesis 3, there is no divine element to it. It is all internal to creation. But somewhere along the line, as you well know, we have inserted sort of a divine being into that scene. So when the serpent says to Eve, eat the apple, it's good, so that you will, it says, your eyes will be opened and you will be like the gods. Go back and read that passage. You will be like the gods. It's not disobedience, pure and simple. It is that what do they think they're going to get out of it? They are going to elevate themselves beyond their human status. And so this knowledge, then the idea of forbidden knowledge, that there are things that humans are not meant to know, that we are creatures ultimately and not divine. And so the very, very interesting part of it. But it's as the legend is elaborated, we find that there are three basic elements of what this forbidden knowledge was. First is I've got weaponry there, but iron, the making of iron, the being able to work metals is considered forbidden knowledge because it leads us to warfare, leads pure and simple. Seduction arts, A lot of it has to do with cosmetics and women's abilities to the things women use to seduce men. So warfare and inappropriate sexuality. And finally, magic. So healing, plants, astrology, all those things that kind of walked the line between, medicine and magic. So those are the three most often given examples. So sin then, so if we have been given knowledge that of things we shouldn't know about, and I've already sort of elaborated this, the sin comes from what we do with this knowledge. So we commit wars, we act appropriately with our sexuality, witchcraft, and there is a strong sense that particularly weaponry and all three of these things are elements that the Jew from this period would have seen as an intrusion from, or part of the syncretism of exposure to the Greek culture. So does that make sense? So these are things that they see as corrupting influences of Hellenism. So it's kind of like the Jewish version of the culture wars, in the ancient world. So then evil, the angels then, the fall of the angels is when they come and teach, they're come to watch us and take care of us, but they're not supposed to give us certain information. But when they do, we take that information, we use it, we sin, and again, there's sort of a cultural issue there. But so that evil begins with the choice of the angels to do what God has forbidden them to do, but then we continue to carry it out. So that's the simpler version. Semihaza is more related to Genesis 6. And so this idea of the sons of God marrying the daughters of women. So angels, so here's the problem, angels who are supposed to be without gender lust after women, and they have sex with them, and they have children. So this idea of sin then here is intermarriage, which is, there's a whole issue of who you can and can't marry in this, if you don't, you need to marry a good Jewish girl kind of thing. So there's some parallels with the cultural issues right here. But it's angels aren't supposed to have sex. So it is a defilement of one of the purest beings around. So, but there's also a sense of, I talked about proper places. We're not supposed to mix categories. Things supposed to, like is supposed to stay with like. Sex then, and again, in general, sex is understood as making a person unclean. Again, not morally. There's no sense that it's morally wrong, but that the act, all those bodily fluids make you ritually unclean. So you can leave that for whatever. And so all of this defilement and impurity disturbs the fundamental balance. It destroys God's created order. But I also wanted to point out that here it is in this section of the Book of the Watchers that you get these hymns to creation, because, like I said, creation is the only part that gets it right. Not even the angels manage to maintain order. So, Semihaza leads a group of angels who come down to earth, marry, have sex with, and have children with the daughters of Adam, or the daughters of earth. And to them are born not normal humans, but what they call the giants. And this is sometimes what people understand the word Nephilim to mean. So their appetites, but so they're giants, they're not human, and they just need more. They're just not meant to live in this world. So appetites destroy, they use up resources, they do, their lusts and their desires are just too much, and it leads them to do things that defile the world. And so in the course of the history of this, then when they die, because they are part immortal, so they have very, very long lives and huge appetites and all, but they're still human. They can be killed, but the immortal part of them remains on Earth and as a spirit or basically demon. So the fall of the angels in this case then is not just the blurring, there's the ritual or the sense of the blurring of order, but there's also the very earthly reality of demons that are created, these figures that don't really care much about humans and have every reason to hate them. And so in the Semihaza version of the story, evil is definitely understood as humans being victimized by choices that they did not make, and by beings that are outside of the earthly realm, and therefore not something we can control. So both of them let us, sort of indicate that evil comes into the earthly realm from the heavenly through angels. So, but how that happens is a little bit different, and how human responsibility. But they both explain that and it's through angels that this is where the heaven and earth meet, and that's a very dangerous place. And so it's here that's the idea of the fall of the angels, which has become so important in some forms of Christianity. So, very, very interesting. Now, before we finish with Enoch, I wanted to point out one more, let me get blank screen, one more element very, very briefly, and that is this Enoch in the Book of the Watchers, chapters 12 through 14, 15, 16, where you have this really fascinating interlude where Enoch is asked to intercede with God for the fallen angels. So, on behalf of the fallen angels. And so you do get a really interesting sense of the role or the power of a righteous man in this literature. That in some ways, a righteous man, a man of God, ranks in some ways even higher than the angels. Don't want to take that too far. But the idea of a righteous man has access to God where the angels do not. So you get in, what I wanted to specifically look at is what it forms a scene in the Divine Council. In chapter 14, you have Enoch taken up into the heavens in a mist or clouds. This is really fascinating because mists and clouds are God's transportation. So if you think about how theophanies, if you don't remember that word from Old Testament, theophany is some sort of visual, visible, sensory, visual image of God or coming of God in some way. So, God rides chariots, God rides mist, but you have Enoch being taken up into the heaven, and he then takes a tour. You have it's the heaven is described as fire and ice. But just real briefly, the things I just want to get across about this idea of human beings, the prophets, various figures, being allowed to enter into the Divine Council, to stand before the throne of God, and to, in this case, intercede for the watchers. Now, he's not successful. God does not back down. But you get this wonderful description. Here again, you see some elements of Daniel 7, but you also see some of the earliest indication of multiple heavens. So you've probably, there's that old TV show, The Seventh Heaven. By the end of this period, as we move into the early Christian period, both in Judaism and Christianity, you have this concept of heaven as being made of levels. And, depending on who you are, you've got God's throne, and some people can get this far or this far or this far. And then, but before the throne, it clearly indicates that Enoch can stand before the throne. But the angelic figures must cover their eyes. So there's just a real interesting sense of what the righteous man of God can do and be in relationship to God that isn't even accessible to the angels, who must hide their faces before God. So go back and read that, because it's really interesting and will help us as we move into both Daniel 7 and the animal apocalypse, where we see more of these divine council scenes. Enoch, in Daniel 7, the Son of Man, and in Enoch 90 of the animal apocalypse, Enoch again. So, and also, I want, when you read this, go back and read it, compare it to Isaiah 6, which is the great passage of, in the year when King Uzziah died, the prophet Isaiah sees God on a throne. That's the probably fundamental passage that stands behind many of these scenes that we're going to be reading about here in Enoch and Daniel and other places like that.